I think this summit is giving us the best kind of homework, how to take better care of ourselves and each other. And when I was preparing to introduce the next panel, a strong woman came to mind, Eleanor Roosevelt, duh. And I've seen a quote that's attributed to her. She said, "A woman is like a tea bag. You can't tell how strong she is until you put her in hot water." And our next panel is full of women who really define what it means to be strong and to take action to help others. Dr. Edythe London, a leading researcher at the UCLA Semel Institute, will moderate and speak with some very special guests. Talinda Bennington is a champion of change to help those who are suffering emotionally receive the care they deserve. She partnered with the Campaign to Change Direction to create 320 Changes Direction. Dr. Barbara Van Dahlen is president of Give an Hour, a nonprofit she founded to provide free mental health services to the military and veteran community. Give an Hour also leads the Campaign to Change Direction, which you will hear more about very shortly. Anna Shinoda is an author, mental health advocate, and passionate supporter of 320 Changes Direction. So Dr. London, if you're ready, please take it away.
I'd like to offer our warmest thanks to Talinda, Barbara, and Anna for being with us today. It really means an awful lot to us. And just following on from what we heard about the developments in the brain, I can tell you that this is an extremely exciting time to be in brain research because we're making remarkable discoveries that help us understand why people have the mental problems that we've been talking about today. And addiction is certainly an area that's benefited from this research because through the advent of brain imaging, we can now look inside the brain and view brain biochemistry and function and get a good understanding, or at least a better understanding, about why people have some of the problems that prevent them from going away from taking drugs that really have negative impact on their lives. This is also a really great time for activism, and it is really the time that we should be changing the culture and the conversation about mental health to reduce the stigma and make it so that people can talk about these problems and are not afraid to go seek the help that is there for them. So today we have 3 panelists who are going to share with us some of their work that's been tremendous in the area of advocacy, and they're also going to tell us something about the personal stories that led them to this work that's really helped the community so much. So maybe I can start with Talinda.
Hi.
And I'd like to just mention that we know that you've had the experience of living with a loved one who's suffering. And more often than not, it's the case that a person doesn't know what to do when he's in this situation. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal journey and what you've learned about this type of situation?
Absolutely. My husband was a great father, great husband, great friend. He was also a lead vocalist of a band called Linkin Park, which many of you I'm sure are aware of. He died by suicide July 20th, 2017. While Chester's music was riddled with thoughts of depression and suicide ideation, and he also had his moments, and moments that required treatment. He took care of himself, and he died when we, his close friends and family, thought he was okay. We thought he was okay. And that is what I'm here today to impress upon everybody I possibly can, that even though we may think our loved one's okay, we still need to know the signs. We need to know the signs of mental wellness, of mental illness. We also need to know what we can do. And when my husband was suffering, there were times when he tried to take his own life. There was times when he was in an alcoholic state of mind, very out of touch with reality, so to speak. I don't know if any of you have any familiarity with that, of a loved one who's just so intoxicated, they're just not here. And in those times, I had no idea what to do. I had no idea. My options were to ignore it, which was hard to do, especially once we had children, or call the cops. And I wasn't about to do that. So oftentimes, my husband just was treated like he's having an episode or he's not well, and I didn't know what to do about it. And when he passed, it was really hard not to blame myself. But I can sit here today and tell you that I don't. And that is because I've learned about his struggles, I've learned about his condition, and through that, I've learned about him a lot more. We were married for almost 12 years. He's my very best friend, and I miss him.
Barbara, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Barbara, you have done a lot of work with Give an Hour and the Campaign to Change, and those organizations directly link all of the panelists, other than me, who are on the stage. Could you talk about this link that brought you all together and how the campaign works and how the organizations can then drive change?
Sure, thank you. And I feel like I'm here with my tribe. I love this. All the talk today about the importance of changing the culture, removing stigma. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I was born in Whittier. I now live back east in Washington, D.C. My father served in World War II. He lied about his age to join the military after Pearl Harbor. And he came home, like a lot of service members did, with post-traumatic stress, although no one would have known what that was back then. He wanted to give his young family a better life, and so he packed up my mom and my 3 older brothers and moved us to the San Joaquin Valley. I wasn't born yet. Moved them to the San Joaquin Valley. What he didn't know was that by moving my mom when she was pregnant with me, that soon after I was born, she had a psychotic break and was later diagnosed as schizophrenic. And so you can imagine this is the 1960s in rural California. So here my dad was, a vet with post-traumatic stress, 3 little boys, a baby girl, and a wife who was psychotic. So that set the stage for me to become a psychologist because I wanted to understand mental health and suffering and do something about it. So I moved east and was going through my own journey of understanding myself, going to graduate school, and graduated, was raising my 2 daughters, and 9/11 happened. And I was in Washington, and I literally watched on television the Pentagon being hit a few miles from where I lived. And I thought, okay, the world has changed, and we need to be ready. We need to be ready because we're going to war, and the men and women who are going to serve in that war are going to be suffering, and we need to be ready to help. And I wanted to help. There was no way to do that. So I started thinking about that. A few years later, in 2004, I was driving around my mom van. We all know those mom vans. They have like the dog and the cat and food and toys. And I was driving with my two daughters, who were 9 and 5 at the time, and we passed a homeless veteran, and my daughter erupted in outrage and said, "Mommy, how can we let this happen to these men who served our country like Grandpa?" She knew about my dad. And so that was the beginning of Give an Hour, and Give an Hour is a national nonprofit organization that for the last 13 years has provided free mental health care to those who serve their families and their communities, 250,000 hours thanks to the volunteerism of mental health professionals all over this country. And so that was great work, and we now have expanded the model, and now we're serving other populations in need. But that wasn't enough. In 2012, there was another tragedy that our nation faced. That was the Sandy Hook shootings. We were working very closely with the Obama administration at the time. Vice President Biden's office reached out and said, "You're doing this work in the mental health space with veterans. What do we need to do in our country? What's missing?" And it was so great hearing the stories of Tipper and Nancy and Gail talk about those early foundational moments that really allowed us to take it then to what we're doing now. So we got together, folks, and created the Campaign to Change Direction, which we launched in 2015 with First Lady Michelle Obama. That work is focused on public health. It's a public health campaign focused on educating everyone about the 5 signs of emotional suffering. It's taking a different tack because we realized as we met and talked that in order to change culture, which is what it's all about, we have to educate everybody about something very basic, very simple. How do you tell when someone's in emotional pain? Talinda was just talking about Chester was in tremendous emotional pain, and having permission to say, "I see you're in pain and I'm not going to stop until we get this addressed." So that was in 2015. In the fall, I had the honor and privilege of meeting Talinda after the loss of Chester. And together, it was very clear immediately that we were going to do this together. We were going to work to change the culture around emotional pain and suffering to make sure that everyone in need is able to receive the care that they deserve. And then because of Talinda, I met Anna. And the 3 of us have now done several panels. I feel like we're getting into the swing of this. And so that's how I came to be working with the 2 of them and how they came to be supporting the work that we're doing.
That's a great story. Anna, could you tell us a little bit about what changing the culture would mean to you?
So just a little background about myself. I'm Anna Shinoda. I'm Mike Shinoda's wife. So Mike was in the band with Chester. So not only did we lose Chester on that day, but we also lost his livelihood. And this plays a little bit into who I am. For me, I've had problems with mental health ever since I was a little girl. Then I thought I was just a big worrier and that my emotions were always all over the place and it was hard for me to control them. I felt more like they were controlling me. And I grew up in a small town, and the only time that people would reach out to get help for their mental health would be if you had a severe, severe case. So we're talking about somebody who is a murderer who walks into a school with a gun. We're talking about somebody who comes back from the war and has PTSD. We're talking about even those commercials where, they're looking out the window and they're looking very depressed and they're saying that, this medication might help you if you're having these problems. None of that, I didn't associate with any of that. And I certainly didn't want to be associated with violence. I didn't want to be associated with erratic behavior because that wasn't true to who I was. And after Chester died, I was dealing with a lot of my emotions through writing because I am a writer. And I wrote this thing about my own mental health journey, and I was not going to put it up anywhere publicly, but I was encouraged to do so. And I put it up on my blog, and it's called Getting Better. And I was really, really scared to put that information out there. Because as Mike's wife, I'm especially concerned about how people might look at me and might judge me. And again, I didn't want to be lined up with those extreme versions. So for me, really, as we change the culture around mental health, and people aren't just looking at that little, that very far extreme version, and you start to look at the whole umbrella of it, and talk about how everyday stress is part of our mental wellness, and managing that. And there's kind of everything in between, and I run the gamut of sometimes I'm very mentally healthy, and sometimes I'm a little bit more mentally ill, and I need to make sure that I'm taking care of myself. So for me, really, as we change that direction, that means that I can come into a room like this and feel like, gosh, I'm not going to be judged for who I am and for the fact that I have had to have quite a bit of help in order to manage my mental health.
That's very, very important. and part of what's so important is that the stigma really prevents people from getting whatever help or treatment is currently available. And it's important for us to know that we are looking for better and better treatments all of the time. But there's a lag time with research, and we need to invest in research to get better treatments. But at this moment, what we really need to do, especially since we have essentially 170 people dying a day from opiate overdose in our country, we need to at least have the stigma removed so that people can go and get those treatments that are currently available, even if they may not be the best ones.
Can I say something about what we have found is, and I think everybody in this room probably gets this, that stigma actually has a stigma. That the word stigma, and there are a lot of wonderful, we work with, our Campaign to Change Direction now has 600 organizations working with us, and many of them are anti-stigma efforts, which is fantastic. But one of the things that we found is that when people hear stigma, they're like, oh, that's them. That's not me. I don't need to listen to that. That's about them. And so as we think about moving the culture shift forward, that's why the work we do, it's about recognizing the signs of emotional suffering, and it's about recognizing signs of emotional well-being, because it allows people who aren't comfortable with that notion of, oh my gosh, I don't have post-traumatic stress, I'm not depressed, to get involved in the conversation.
Well, going a little bit further with that, I'd like to ask you, Talinda, what does depression in a loved one look like? Is it different than what we all might have thought depression looks like?
To answer that question, I would like to ask the audience to look around you. That's the face of depression. It's a normal-looking person. The lady sitting next to you, across the table. You may or may not recognize it. It could be there or not. It could be there for an entire lifetime, or it may come on when you lose a loved one. My point is there is no face of depression.
One of the things that we've all talked about is, as we do these conversations, one of the things that I love to do is to ask an audience like this, if there's anyone here who has not been touched by mental health, either they themselves or someone they love, raise your hand. And no one ever does, ever, and never. And what's cool about it is not that no one ever raises their hand, but you see people look around and for the first time maybe realize it's not just me, it's not just my family, it's all of our families, and that is the point. That's the work we're doing. It's about Talinda's point, Anna's point. Anna and I have talked about the continuum. It's like sometimes you have a cold, sometimes you have the flu, and sometimes you have cancer. Mental health, we all know this, it's exactly the same, but pushing that message, finding amazing partners to do the work, that's what we are excited about, because we can see the culture is starting to shift. We're not there yet, but we're moving it.
I'm just wondering what your thoughts are related to resilience. What's needed for somebody to recover? Any of you?
I'll say in this past year, actually 9 months, I've learned much more about resilience than I have ever in my life. Chester passed away, and then 4 months to the day later, my mother passed away as well, just when I felt like I was getting my feet back on the ground from Chester dying. And one of the things that I found is that just taking things moment by moment and remembering that things are for a moment is really important for resilience as far as in my life. And because if you can make it through like one of your worst moments, you're going to be able to keep going. And I really think that on some days when the pain was really coming back from losing both Chester and my mom, I remember nothing will be as bad as the pain on the day that we lost Chester. And so it's just a moment by moment. This too shall pass.
Well,
if I might.
Of course.
Just one of the things, and I have one little visual. So when you go out, you'll see these cards sitting around. Pick one up. These are the 5 signs of emotional suffering, not diagnosing, not labeling. It's just recognizing when people are in pain. And on the other side is the signs of healthy habits of emotional well-being. There are tons of them. But the point is, everybody should know what theirs are. Everyone should know what works for them. I swim. That's really important to me. I put in my music, I swim.
I horseback ride.
Right. Anna writes, and
I also hike. I love hiking.
And we all have these things, but we don't teach our kids typically. We don't talk about them typically. Women do it much better than men. We know that. But none of us do it as much as we could or should. So one of the things that we're really helping, I think, with this conversation is one size doesn't fit all. Research. Changing the culture drives research. Research gives us information to change the culture. So they're intersecting, but they're critical to push this out.
And certainly, a supportive environment is absolutely essential. And I know that Lincoln Park did an awful lot to create that environment, not only for the band members, their families, and the extended family of the group. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Do you want me to take this?
Go ahead.
Okay. So one of the things is that a Lincoln Park show, your backstage area is not going to look like your stereotypical backstage area. We respect the crew members and the members of the band who are in the program and who are sober. So we have places for them that are safe places where drugs and alcohol are not allowed. Other bands, they can be doing their things, but in our specific area, drugs and alcohol are not allowed. And that just lets them know, like, hey, we want you to be comfortable here too, which I think is a huge part of it. And another big part was we were always super close. All of the wives hang out together and all of our kids are together. And so when Chester when we needed to step in and help Chester more, everybody was supportive. The guys in the band even did like a week of therapy with him. So, there was, we were all about making sure that we were letting him know and other people in our organization know that we were absolutely supportive of his recovery and also just of being good friends and having conversations.
That's really good. Talinda, I've heard you mention a really astonishing fact, and it is that there are 17 classifications of homicide, but only 1 for suicide. Yeah. And I wonder if you would be kind enough to tell us why that should change.
I'm very passionate about this. It makes my blood boil, to be perfectly honest with you. One definition does not encompass an entire generation of people lost due to suicide. Just as we classify homicides through the characteristics of the homicide, we even consider the mental health of the murderer to see if they're criminally insane or not. When my husband died, he was not actively suicidal. He just left a family trip. We have a beautiful cabin in Sedona. We were just with our children. He was kicking off a tour for a #1 album. He was in treatment. He loved being sober. He had 6 months sobriety under his belt. And it was an impulsive decision. And it took his life. That is different than somebody who writes a suicide note and says they're going to do it. Or that is different than somebody that dies by an intentional drug overdose because they're high. It's different. I think that we need to change that. So if there's anybody in the room that wants to be on board with me to do that, talk to me after.
I think it really speaks to our discomfort in talking about this kind of emotional pain. You know, my husband's father also took his life years ago, many years ago. And when that happened in he was from a small town, the family literally didn't show up to the funeral. And we know of these stories across our country, they still happen. And so I think this distinction is because we are very, very uncomfortable and we don't know what to do or how to approach or how to respond or how to deal with families whose loved ones are dealing with. You know, we don't bring casseroles over for people who a child is having a psychotic break, or someone just lost someone to suicide. We're starting to see more the proper word, died by suicide. We're starting to see movement, but I think that's an indication of we're not there yet.
And if I can just add something to that, since Chester's died, quite a few people have come up and talked to me about how they've had suicide attempts. And they all say the same 2 things. One, that they are so glad to still be here. And the other thing that they say is, I was so embarrassed afterwards. I was so embarrassed. And in some of those cases, they said, I was so embarrassed that I didn't seek help for another 10 years. And that is a huge, huge problem because of the shame associated with suicide or suicide attempts.
And there's been some great, is this better? Now you can hear me? There's been some great research that people have done, especially in the military and veteran space, looking at suicide attempts, and that the vast majority of people who attempted but did not complete the suicide, they did not die, report that they just wanted to end the pain, and that they didn't really want to die, they just wanted to end the pain. And so again, I think we're seeing if the more we can do to elevate the conversation will help people who are suffering.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the combination of the depression with addiction. So we know that individuals who have a mood or anxiety disorder are twice as likely to have a problem with drugs or alcohol, and people who have a substance abuse disorder are twice as likely or more to have an associated psychiatric disorder. What we know about brain function is that drugs of abuse erode the very circuitry that is important for maintaining mood and preventing anxiety. The frontal cortex and its connection to lower centers that's important in modulating mood is disordered. Talinda, I'm wondering to what extent you thought that Chester's problem was driven by the addiction or the primary depression?
I think it was, I know he was clinically depressed from a young age. I know he was untreated. I know that he chose to self-medicate during his teenage years. And I know that in his adult life, he suffered from addiction to alcohol, as well as having depression. I cannot speak on his diagnosis because I wasn't in the room with him and his therapist, but I do know that from being married to him and being with him. And I do know that when hindsight's always 20/20, right? Looking back, knowing what I know now, I could see times when and triggers for him that would cause him to spiral. And when he would start spiraling, then he'd drink. And then it was chaos.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm thinking that what we really need to do is to work harder on this bi-directional information flow from research to the community to understand what the questions should be more, and getting the answers from what we do in the laboratory out so that they become available. Do you have any ideas for how we can move forward on that?
Oh, I always have lots of.
Okay.
So I think that one of the things, because we're very pleased and excited that UCLA is going to join us. We're doing our second global summit on mental health culture change in London in October, and you're all invited. Come to London, join us. The last day of the 4-day event, we're hosting a concert at the London Palladium, and Talinda and I are going to host that together with some friends. And so at that event and other events, we partner with organizations that are doing research and using social media, pushing that information out in ways that people can make use of. Again, back to the simplicity of know the 5 signs. It's simple bites. You know, the three of us were with Maria Shriver earlier this week, which was a lovely conversation, and we talked about the simplicity, how important it is to get the information out in simple chunks so that people can grab it and use it. And so one of the things that we're also working on is a technological response to this, which will allow people to access information real time, whether it's about somebody's mental health condition or how to find resources or what the latest research is. But it's got to be simple and frequent. Saturation.
That sounds good. Thank you so much. And I'm afraid we're running short on time, and I'd like to just thank the panelists for being here. It's such a great honor to be on stage with you. And we're going to move on.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very meaningful way to wrap up this day. I know that everyone in this room has their own story. So many people here and throughout our community are dedicated to improving women's health, our whole health. We've heard a common thread from all the experts that mental health and physical health are completely intertwined. Maya Angelou said, "I'm interested in women's health because I'm a woman. I'd be a damn fool not to be on my own side." So look around. We are a community in this room, and we can support each other. And I hope you found many takeaways from the women who spoke here today. Clearly, working together and getting the help we deserve makes us stronger. So this is there is a table of resources outside, ways to get involved. So please stop by if you haven't, and many of our speakers have books that are for sale out there. And one request All right, in a minute. One request as you leave today, share what you learned. Let's keep the conversation going. It's been an honor to MC the Wonder of Women Summit, and I want to give a big thank you to Terry and Cece. Wow, you're wonderful women. And Vicki and Nancy. Woo-hoo! And everyone here, thank you. You supported this event, and it's been an inspiring day. Wow. Thank you, everyone.